thank Shane Wagner for being here this evening. When Shane wrote this book a year or two ago, he gave it to the library. So all the proceeds that from the sale of this book go to benefit the library. So we can't thank Shane enough for his generosity and for sharing his talents with us. So thanks again, Shane, for being here. Welcome.
I'm going to go through a couple slideshows that I put together. When I started looking at the information I had for this, I realized I had actually 3 different slideshows. Tammy and I kind of mashed those together. We'll talk a little bit about what ghost stories are, since it's close to Halloween. We're here alone in a supposedly haunted library. Tammy, myself, and my wife, Ashley. So if I'm looking off the screen, I'm looking at her. I'm not just staring off into space. So let's go ahead and get started. So again, like I said, the first thing we're going to talk about is what is a ghost story? Why do we care about these things? We're going to talk about the history of Chester and the haunting at the landmark. And then if we've arranged this correctly, we're going to last talk about the haunting here at the Chester Public Library. So when you start looking at the history of ghost stories, you find that human beings have believed in ghosts in at least some form since the earliest days that we became a species. Archaeologists have even discovered that Neanderthals, our close evolutionary relatives, practice burial rituals. There is a universal belief in the continued existence of the human soul after death. And I think that is because we're conscious beings. We realize that we're here. We realize that we will not always be here. And we look for something sort of world to come, as it were. Funeral rites across various cultures, depending on people's belief systems, the main purpose of the funeral is to put the deceased individual to rest. So myself, most of the funeral ceremonies I've been to at Lutheran and Catholic churches, at the end you hear the phrase, "Rest eternal grant unto him, and let perpetual light shine upon him." The idea behind that is that we're putting this soul to rest. A ghost then is what happens when that soul does not find rest in our cultural context here in the West. But all cultures throughout the world see ghosts as restless spirits of the dead. In our belief system, these ghosts are often bound to a place. So this building that we're in is supposedly haunted. The ghosts failed to find rest because of some unfinished business or some wrong that was done to them. And they can appear as spirits, a sort of wispy, translucent silhouette, or even an apparition, a human likeness of a dead person. There's some different types of hauntings, and you'll hear a little bit about a few of these tonight when I start telling my stories. The traditional haunting is what I just described. You see a ghost walking around or something like this. There's also this belief in a portal haunting. And this is a thought that these passageways exist out there between the world that we're in and the next. That could be another dimension. It could be another realm. Native Americans selected their burial sites based on a perceived connection to the spirit world, and we aren't much different. Many of our cemetery sites were also subconsciously selected for exactly the same reason. If any of you out there have read my book, you'll remember maybe in the intro where I talk about the views of the Mississippi Valley that we're able to get here in Chester. And I say that my favorite view of the river in the valley is through a gap in the Missouri Bluffs where I can see the Ozark Hills on the western horizon. It's not you can see that from any point along the Chester Bluff from north to south, but the place where that view through the bluffs is most striking is right at Evergreen Cemetery. And I don't think that that's a coincidence that you see through into Missouri from that particular place. Again, looking through into Missouri, but in the eyes of the people building the cemetery, it's like you're looking across to the other side. The last one here is a residual haunting. This is the thought that some imprint or scene from the past plays itself out. People who think this way believe that buildings store their experiences somehow. Paranormal researchers believe that moving water, railroad tracks, and limestone are all conduits for paranormal activity. So that means that Chester is a perfect place for ghost stories. This was the point in my presentation where I polled everyone who was here before about what they thought about ghosts. And I found some of this polling information online. 45% of Americans, almost half, claim that they believe in ghosts. 2/3 of them believe in God, and 2/3 believe in some form of supernatural activity. When I asked the question, certain people in the room raised their hand. Yes, I believe in ghosts. Others didn't. But if ghosts aren't real, then why are there all these stories? The people who believe that these experiences happen to them are not simply lying. It could be that it is a reflection of our community's collective memory in a place with such a long history. It could be the power of the mind playing tricks on you, or it can be simply an expression of your cultural custom and the folklore of the region that you're from. And I went into this book with the pretense that we could learn something about our community and its history by studying its legends and lore. So then, is Chester really haunted? I say in my introduction, and I'll say it on here, I don't really know if ghosts are real in the way that I'm really sitting here, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's a real experience to certain people, and it's an experience that's entered our cultural context. A man named John Allen was the important historian of Southern Illinois. He lived from the 1880s to the 1960s. And in one of his books, he describes this area as a historical eddy, Southern Illinois and the Ozark region. The pioneer way of life, especially in the internal part of Southern Illinois, not so much in a small industrial city like Chester, but in the internal areas of Southern Illinois and the Ozark region in Missouri, the pioneer way of life and the superstitions persisted longer. And even though our community in the 19th and early 20th centuries was a progressive industrial place, those superstitions worked their way into our thinking here as well. Each culture and each new generation adds their own spin on stories. And some of the local ghosts that we have here appear to be hundreds of years old. The oldest one, if you read the book, is the story about Paget's Mill. And Mr. Paget was murdered over 255 years ago. So that's been believed to be haunted for 2.5 centuries. So what we're going to look at here is the history of our community, and this leads us into the haunting at Chester's oldest building, the Landmark Inn down on the river. You can't study Chester's history without knowing the history of Kaskaskia. Kaskaskia is established, depending on how you look at it, in the late 1600s or early 1700s. Most of us locally know that it was a major government and trading center for the French Empire, and it was, of course, the first capital city of Illinois. The sketch here that you see done by my friend Melanie Baker, these appear in my book. This is the old Kaskaskia Hotel. Its biggest claim to fame is that Lafayette was entertained here when he came back to the United States for his American tour in 1825. This building here is actually in the library's collection. They have like an original of this photograph, and that's the first way I ever saw it. This is the first Capitol building of Illinois. And the gentleman who is standing in the doorway is Gustavus Pape. And in my book, in this chapter about Kaskaskia, it's Mr. Pape's account that we use to describe the breach over at Kaskaskia when the town was destroyed by the Mississippi in the 1880s. Here we see what the old river channel looked like. But if you look north of Chester, northwest in what's the Kaskaskia Township here, you'll see that the river has not changed course. The Kaskaskia River enters the Mississippi right in front of Menard Prison, not where it does now up on the river bend there by Fort Kaskaskia. You see the village there, and you also see the cut bank of the Mississippi getting very close to the Kaskaskia River just northwest of the village. That's where the river channel breached, and it destroyed Kaskaskia. By the 1810s, long before that happened, steamboats start to appear on our inland rivers throughout the United States. The biggest river system, of course, is the Mississippi, which is the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, and all of these tributaries. These are our highways back in those days. There are no railroads, and there are not very many good roads, especially out here this far. Developers start to look in the area around Kaskaskia for a river port, because you'll see the Kaskaskia village is not on the Mississippi, and it's difficult for these steamboats to navigate. So they settled on Chester. The reason they put a town here is because it is the first place that the Mississippi River touches the Illinois Bluff, coming south out of Alton. In 1816, a guy named John McFerrin built the first home here, although someone who read the Lewis and Clark diaries told me that there was a home here as during the Lewis and Clark expedition, many years before 1816. So people had settled here for over 200 years. By the late 1810s, a community named Portland starts to develop. It's built about where Menard Prison stands now. But in 1829, the town we would recognize as Chester was first laid out by a gentleman named Samuel Smith. This gives us a view of the old river channel. If you look down here, you can see the north and south cell houses at Menard and the administration building in the middle. You're looking across the back of those buildings that we're so familiar with. We usually see them from the other side. But you'll notice that we're looking across the river into Missouri. But instead of looking at the old channel and the slough and the bayou, the woods over there, you're actually looking directly at the Mississippi River here, going out in front of you. And to the right would be the Kaskaskia coming in. Here's another depiction of the old river channels, and I have an illustration similar to this in my book. The old channel's on the left, and the more modern appearance of it is on the right. This is a snapshot of one of Chester's old town maps, and here you can see the original town. It's a small 4-block survey. The landmark sits on Ferry Street. The guy who built the landmark is this gentleman named Thomas Mather. He was an important figure in early Illinois history. He's a descendant of Cotton Mather. Cotton and Increase Mather, they have an interesting Halloween connection because they're the gentlemen who are sometimes blamed for the harsh prosecution of the Salem witch trials in the 1680s. Mather came to Kaskaskia here in 1818, the same year Illinois became a state. He was a prominent advocate for the abolition of slavery, and he helped defeat a slavery referendum here in Illinois in 1822. He was actually the Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives, and he was one of those very first people that moved the businesses down from Kaskaskia to this new river port that we today call Chester in 1830. And that is when he built the landmark, November 1830. So the building is now 190 years old. This is an image of Mr. Mather I was able to find. It was an old painting of him. Thomas Mather and his business partners shut down their operations in 1837, and the three gentlemen wind up in Springfield, Illinois, where they become important citizens, and all that's talked about in my book. Mather knew Abraham Lincoln, and he's mentioned a few times in Abraham Lincoln's personal papers. But even though Mather moved 150 miles north to Springfield, he maintained ownership of the building that we now call the Landmark all the way until his death in 1853. And because of his connections to abolition and the Underground Railroad that you find references of when you study him, we think that's why people often talk about the Landmark being a stop on the Underground Railroad. My formatting is a little bit off on this slide, but some folks named Barry purchased the Landmark from Mather's estate. And right here, you can see an advertisement out of a newspaper called the Randolph County Democrat. We have that paper microfilmed here at the library, and from the years 1857 to 59. And this same advertisement for Barry's store there appears many times. So he's operating a store in this building, and he and his daughter owned the structure for some 82 years. They're probably the longest owners of the building. They certainly are the longest owners of the building. The Landmark today sits on the river sort of all by itself. The only other buildings down there that are that old are some of the homes on the hill, the Cliff House behind it, the two-story building with the large stone basement that sits on the stone retaining wall. Samuel Smith's house is up there from before the Civil War. The Cohen home was built before the Civil War, and the old Presbyterian church, which is now the Stone House. Those buildings are all still there from this early period. But as far as commercial buildings, the Landmark is pretty much all that's left. This view right here is of Water Street. You're right about where the boat ramp is. You'll notice in the original plot of Chester that was called Ferry Street. In later times, I think the ferry was further down. The ferry that some people may have actually, that are still around, may have been familiar with, didn't necessarily land in exactly that spot. So this is Water Street. You can see the railroad tracks, which tell us this picture would have been taken after 1901. Here's a view of the Chester riverfront. Again, under normal circumstances, I would point the Landmark building out to you, but it is the building with the, about 1, 2, 3, or 4 rows of buildings up, horizontal to the river, and you can see the downriver gable end of the building gives it away. That's the Landmark. Here again, we're looking down, and the Landmark is the building that we see sort of on the left side of the picture here. I had to get my bearings about me. I haven't seen that in a while. Tammy told me that I can use the cursor. There it is. That's the Landmark. All right. Yes. Here's another view of that old business district, and glad I got the cursor here because that would not have been easy to describe. This is near the end of the old Chester Riverfront Business District, and I know that because you can see the bridge in the background. After the bridge was built, it was no longer necessary to come down here to get across the river, and flooding became a larger issue at that time. And it wasn't long after that the railroad moved their tracks and demolished most of these buildings. This is the street that now goes underneath the railroad viaduct, or down by the water pump house. Here's the corner where the Landmark building sits. If you walk across the street from the boat ramp and look, you can actually see this curb is still there. And the Landmark didn't look like it does now until the late 1800s. In 1892, after Mr. Berry passed away, his daughter added the second story to the building, and they called that the St. Louis Flats, and they had apartments up there. Unfortunately, we cannot find a photograph from before that time. Throughout this period, the landmark's apartments, a bakery, a buggy shop. As the riverfront starts to decline, you have problems with vagrancy, flooding, as I talked about a second ago, the bridge construction. All of that sort of brings down that area. This is a photograph from the flood of 1943, I believe, and you can see why it's starting to become a problem down there. The landmark's been a tavern and a restaurant since the 1940s. This is an advertisement I found in the paper from that time. As I talked about, the railroad eventually demolished all of the buildings down there, and they put the track up on a levee. If you look very carefully, especially right across from the boat ramp there where the railroad levee and the rock gets particularly high, you can actually still see the walls of those buildings all down through there. This all happened in 1957. The landmark was only saved because its owner took the railroad to court. They wanted to demolish it as well. There you see it sitting in the background of the demolished buildings. These are the remnants of the walls that you can actually still see if you look carefully down there on the riverfront. So Jim and Rose Otting owned the building in 1986. They wound up being the source of a lot of the ghost stories in the book, although since the landmark's been reopened as the St. Nicholas, it's adding more and more ghost stories, it seems like, almost every day. The slideshow says "Here we are" because I originally gave this presentation down there at the landmark, but these are a couple photos of the renovation. And now we'll talk about why this building is haunted. So you just got a crash course, not just of the history of the landmark, but of the founding and early history of Chester. And we really had a hard time finding out why this building may have been haunted, but we know there are a tremendous amount of ghost stories about it. You can read them in my book. You'll hear about glass ashtrays shattering. Of course, that's not an issue anymore since the smoking ban took effect. You'll hear about the ice scoop flying across the kitchen, people working in the upstairs being grabbed, people actually seeing apparitions walking around the building or looking out the northwest windows, walking down the back staircase. Folks have seen an old man down in the lower level of the building, a young girl looking in a mirror. There are just a lot of different ghost stories down at the landmark. People hearing voices throughout the building. It's really a very haunted place, at least in the minds of the folks who work down there. And we really had a hard time figuring out why exactly that was. There was no specific tragedy pinned to the place. But if you read my book, you will see something that we discovered. This is the grave of Mr. Barry there on the right. The family that owned that building for the longest, Ashley, my wife, Tammy, and I were down here at the library one night after it closed, and I was really trying to dig up information to definitively say, why is this landmark building haunted? I had a couple ideas. There were some horrible cholera outbreaks down there on the old riverfront in the 1830s and 1840s. There was a tornado that killed people very near the landmark. That happened during the Civil War. And there were just a lot of speculation, about the building being with the Underground Railroad and a brothel. But then one night, again, down here at the library after closing time, I think it was even maybe storming outside, we were looking through an old biographical sketch record, and we found the Barry family mentioned in the biographical sketch record. And they actually, as I was reading it, they professed their religious beliefs to be spiritualists. That was very very unusual. Spiritualists are people who believe you can summon the dead through seances and things like this. And it was common in the late 19th century, especially after the Civil War, when lots of people died and no one got to say goodbye to their loved ones. But it was very, very unusual to tell a biographical sketch record that people were going to be looking at for all time that you were a spiritualist. The rest of Mr. Barry's family at that time claimed to be Methodists. I found a digital version of this book, and I did a word search for spiritualist, and there are thousands of people profiled in the book because it's a tri-county, Randolph, Jackson, and Perry, I believe. Of all the thousands of people profiled in the book, only Mr. and Mrs. Barry, that is the only time the word spiritualist is used in that book to describe them. So that at least gave me something to know maybe why people started saying that that old building was haunted. If people in the community knew that the Barrys were sitting in there and doing seances and things like that, it would tend to lend itself to some of those ghost stories. This is a still from a video that was taken on video surveillance down there after the landmark reopened. And I've watched this video many times, and it's very strange. You're in the kitchen here, which is where this paranormal activity, one of the sites for it supposedly, and you're looking back into the pantry. And if you look at the two stills on the right, you'll see something on the floor that's not on the floor in the first two. What that is two large cans. I think it was cans of tomatoes or something like that. They actually flew off of the pantry shelf and down onto the floor. And again, I've seen that video many times. It happened after the building had closed up for the night, and it happened since the renovation. So this probably took place just maybe a year or two ago when this happened. And the thing that makes it even more, I guess, scary is the way that this was discovered. Nobody knew that this had happened. I guess somebody came in there the next day and picked up a can off the floor, didn't think much of it. This camera that shot this footage actually failed to work. And when the surveillance company came to replace it, they can't send a technician down to fix the thing because it was brand new. They had just done all this renovation work. And in order to troubleshoot, the gentleman rolled the tape. It's not literally a tape, it's digital, I assume. Rolled the footage, and he found that right after this can went flying off the shelf, the camera stopped working. That's when it failed. So I joke in my book that perhaps the ghosts don't like being filmed. This is a picture I took, again, shortly after the opening with the building all renovated, of it sitting out, looking out over the river. So I think that the ghost legends that you hear about the landmark are probably because it's been there for so long. It's a sole survivor of that old riverfront community. Chester today is almost entirely up here on the bluff. And I think those memories and that connection with the Underground Railroad, with the Barry family spiritualist beliefs, and some of the other sort of trauma and tragedy that took place down there on the riverfront leads us to say that the landmark is haunted. So that was that story. The other stories in my book are about the curse of Kaskaskia, the haunting at Paget's Mill, the haunting at the Weinrich House at the corner of Oak Dyke and Route 3, and of course the haunting of your public library, courtesy probably of Mr. Cole back here. Interestingly, Mr. Cole, the source of the haunting, this portrait is far less frightening than the portrait of his father on the other side of the room that you'll see here in a second. So we'll go ahead and go through the library's haunting and hope that nothing strange happens. I tried to get Ashley to like walk behind us here with her hair pulled down over her eyes, but she refused. So I'm I'm sorry. The library story is the Cole family's story. And they were essentially the people who built our community, I think, more than anyone else. So many of our institutions, everything from the Museum and Archives building, which was an annex to the old Randolph County Courthouse, all the way up to Chester Hospital, Cole Memorial Park, this library, we owe all of those things, all of those community institutions to the Cole family. They really were tremendous contributors to the construction of this town and its development. It all started way back at the very beginning in 1837 when Nathan Cole, the patriarch of the family, brought himself out here from New York State. He started a milling operation down there on the riverfront 182 years ago. This depiction of the mill down here is from a book that the company published in the 1930s celebrating their centennial. So the mill on the riverfront that still exists can trace its lineage back 182 years. It's one of the oldest commercial enterprises in this region. To give you that some context, this makes it like 15 years older than Anheuser-Busch. H.C. Cole, Nathan Cole's son, turned the mill enterprise into a massive industrial operation. He's responsible, he and his brothers, for the first patent flour in the United States, and he built a new mill facility in the 1870s. He's the one that started this legacy of community service. H.C. Cole, this is another portrait here in the library. I believe it came from one of the Cole family homes. He is the gentleman who built the Gothic stone building down on the courthouse grounds that today houses the Randolph County Museum and Archives. That was during the Civil War period that was constructed. This is what the mill that H.C. Cole and his brothers constructed looked like. You see, it's quite an improvement over the sketch that I showed you a minute ago. It's a very large commercial operation, and they focused most of their product on, which they called Omega flour, on markets in the South. They eventually had a large sales fleet and offices just down the river there in Memphis. H.C. Cole's son is the gentleman here, Charles Briggs Cole. He was born in 1845. He was the first member of the family, or the first generation of the family, that was actually born here in Chester. The Cole family, I guess, were an old American family, and they were people of means. They were able to send Charles to Harvard. Charles graduated from Harvard in the 1860s, about 1867, and he studied business and engineering. And he came back to Chester. I don't believe any Chester alum have gone to Harvard recently, but if they did, I wouldn't expect him to come back today. Charles did, however. Charles came back from Harvard and participated in the family business for the rest of his life. In 1915, Cole's mill burned to the ground. And Charles was already 70 years old when that happened, but he was able to construct a new facility from the ground, essentially, in time for the October harvest. So in about 7 months, the mill that you see down there today was built. Pretty amazing, especially for, over 100 years ago. This is what it looked like on the left in 1939. And on the right, you can see that's a picture I took from the river on a boat out in front of the mill. That's what it looks like today. So very similar, just some more elevators have been constructed. Continuing his father's legacy of investment in the community, Charles and his daughter Alice were big supporters of a public library for Chester. The first public library that we had was in a building that they called the Phoenix Block, down on the corner of Taylor Street and State Street, across from the courthouse. It's the building that most of us would remember as the First National Bank building that was torn down a few years back. But that library that was in that building housed about 4,000 volumes. Chester had wanted to have a Carnegie library, but the Carnegie Commission by the late 1920s wasn't building libraries anymore. And so Charles decided that he himself would give us a library, something like that caliber. So in 1928, they start construction on this building. And it's such a neat story how he did this. He announced it at the Chamber of Commerce banquet, and he asked the citizens of Chester, he said, I'm going to build this thing for you. All I want you to do is purchase the land. And I think the reason that he did that was so that everyone in the community had a sort of buy-in and felt like they were part of the facility. They paid $6,500 for land that this building sits on. And that's actually a lot of money in 1928. That's the equivalent of almost $100,000 today. And they raised that $100,000 equivalent in 1 week. 1 week is all it took for the people of Chester to donate quarters, nickels, dimes. Some of the business people donated larger amounts. The folks, the Rickmans that at that time owned the Mullins home across the street from here, they'd made large donations. And within a week, they had the $6,500 necessary to purchase the land that this building sits on. The story takes a bit of a tragic turn, though. Mr. Cole was vacationing at his winter home down in Biloxi, Mississippi, and he sent word and said, I'll be back to Chester, and then once I get back there, we can open the new library up. So he gets home and he sat down for this portrait, which was painted with excess monies from the purchase of the land. There was some money left over, and they hired a painter from Chicago to come down here and paint that portrait. And just after the portrait was finished, and just before the library was opened, Mr. Cole passed away. So we often tell the story to say that he never saw his project finished. That isn't actually accurate. He would have got to see this building as it appeared, but some of the fittings and the books and things weren't in it yet. But he did get to see his building built, but he never got to see it used. And here's where the origin of, I think, the library's ghost story comes in. The first public function of this facility was to serve as the place for Mr. Cole's funeral. And his casket was laid out right in front of where I'm sitting. And hundreds and hundreds of people, not just from Chester, but from all over the United States, Nashville, Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, Memphis, Little Rock, Arkansas, people in the milling business came here to Chester, and they got to pay their respects to Mr. Cole. They also got to see his legacy for the community, which is this library building. But having a building like this with this eerie painting and its first function being a funeral has been the source of some of, I think, its ghost stories. I took this picture of the library at night, and you can get a good view for what the building looks like and a notion for why people might think it's haunted just based on its appearance. To tell you the story of the library's haunting, I'm going to read a little bit out of my book. I didn't do that with the landmark story because there's so many ghosts down at the landmark that the haunting section of that chapter is like 10 pages long. So here we go. No one is sure when the first reports of paranormal activity were recorded at the library, but countless staff, patrons, and visitors have reported unusual happenings for several decades. Since the completion of the addition in the back, workers have reported that the elevator occasionally cycles itself down and up as though it is bringing someone up from the lower level. Doors open and no one, at least no one visible, emerges. I really hope that that doesn't happen right now. I might have to leave. Inspections have revealed that the elevator system, only used a few times each day, is in perfect operating condition. A bell in the vestibule attached to the entry door often rings out, announcing a patron. When employees approach the front room, however, there have been many times that no one is waiting at the desk. At night, at least 2 janitors have reported hearing their names called out quite clearly, only to find that they were here in the building alone. Others report the odor of pipe tobacco in the main room. And one of the last times we were here before all of this craziness in the world happened, Ashley and I were going downstairs in the front staircase here in the main room, and we detected a very strong odor of pipe tobacco. So strong, in fact, that we weren't frightened by it. We thought that there was someone downstairs who had just been smoking a pipe, and no one had apparently been down there for the majority of the day. That was strange, to say the least. Books are sometimes found to fall from shelves without reasonable explanation. Housekeepers have reported an uncomfortable feeling in the southwest corner of the main room, right about where Ashley's sitting right now. And a younger patron once reported a low set of glowing eyes in that corner, also where Ashley's sitting, during a nighttime scavenger hunt. The young man quickly forfeited the contest and returned to the lower level, very frightened. Staff claim that old libraries often kept cats, and there's no record of their presence here in Chester, so we don't really know what those eyes were. The strangest incident that I could get folks to talk about who work here at the library involved a simple yardstick. This is a good one. A few workers were in the lower level of the building, and someone was reading aloud from a book explaining how to determine if a building is haunted. The book described leaning a stick against the wall and calling out to determine if any spirits present could make it fall on command. As the employee read these words, a yardstick inadvertently leaned against a pillar in the next room, smacked the floor, and scared all of the witnesses bad. So people speculate a lot about who's haunting the library. Haunting has a negative connotation. It seems like an inappropriate term in this case. I wrote the book to help the library. I don't want you all to be so frightened of it that you don't come here. Library staff members are not frightened by the building, or they tell me they're not anyway. The 2 senior employees assured me that they wouldn't have lasted over 25 years here if they were legitimately terrified by their experience. So it seems to me that if there are spirits at the library, they might come from Chester's collective memories of an earlier time. Perhaps, though, Charles Briggs Cole can look down on his gift to Chester's citizens. He was a man of progress and innovation, and would have undoubtedly been thrilled to see that even as times change, his legacy of cultural advancement lives on in the modern library's work. Miss Minnie, a librarian who served here for a long time that I mentioned in my book, she would also be interested in seeing how her life's work is being carried on here at the library today. Probably find it hard to imagine that someone was sitting here giving a presentation to folks all over the place via something called Zoom, which is new to me as well. If there are spirits at the library, perhaps they're watching over and not haunting this remarkable living piece of Chester's history. So there's 2 histories and 2 ghost stories out of my book. Like I said, there are a few more chapters, and there's also an introductory chapter explaining why I'm interested in this, and then setting the scene for the ghosts and haunting of Chester. That's all that I have for you folks this evening. I'm going to turn this back over to Tammy.
Someone just asked where they can purchase the book. We do have a limited amount of copies available here at the Chester Library. They're $15. And like I said, all proceeds from the sale of the book go to benefit the library. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can give us a call here at the Chester Library, 826-3711, or stop in. Shane's got one right there.
Here it is. I should have shown you earlier.
Many thanks again to Shane and for all of you for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.